It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. The kind of evening where the clinking of plates and the hum of casual chatter fills the dining room. I had just placed a fresh bowl of roasted vegetables on the table when I heard it. His laugh. Not the laugh I once knew, not the carefree sound of a boy who used to run through the halls of this very house, calling out for me. No, this laugh was sharp, mocking, and cold. "She's just dead weight," my son said, his voice dripping with arrogance. The words hung in the air like smoke. I froze. My hand still rested on the handle of the serving spoon, but my fingers went numb. Dead weight. That was me in his eyes. His mother. The woman who carried him, raised him, sacrificed every ounce of herself so he could stand taller than she ever did. The room erupted with laughter from his wife and one of his friends, and for a moment I thought I had misheard. But when I looked up, his smirk confirmed everything. He hadn't whispered it. He wanted me to hear. I lowered my gaze quickly, pretending to adjust the napkins, anything to avoid the sting of humiliation burning my face. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest I was sure the whole table could hear it. Inside, a storm brewed, but outside I remained silent. I had learned silence long ago. Silence when my shoes had holes, but I smiled and told him new sneakers would come soon. Silence when I skipped meals, pushing the last piece of bread onto his plate, claiming I wasn't hungry. Silence when I worked myself sick just to keep this house, his inheritance, standing tall. And now, here I was, being reduced to nothing but a burden. He didn't know that I had already begun to notice the change in him. The way he dismissed me in conversations, the impatient sighs when I asked simple questions, the way his wife rolled her eyes every time I entered the room. Still, a part of me clung to hope that my son, my only child, would never go so far as to devalue me entirely. But tonight, that hope cracked. I sat down quietly at the end of the table. They carried on laughing and making plans for trips, for renovations they wanted to do to the mansion once it was theirs. My son poured himself another glass of wine, leaning back comfortably in the chair that once belonged to his father. He looked so secure, so entitled, as if the walls around him were already his by right. Inside, my mind raced. Each word they spoke painted a clearer picture of how they truly saw me. Not as a mother, not as a person, but as an obstacle in their way. My fork touched the food, but I couldn't taste a thing. I thought of my late husband, of the nights we stayed up talking about building a legacy for our family, of the mansion that stood as proof of our sacrifices. He would be heartbroken to hear his son laugh at the very woman who carried him through fire. A quiet strength began to stir within me. If my son believed I was dead weight, then he was about to learn a lesson in just how heavy my silence could become. I didn't speak a word that night. I smiled faintly when the plates were cleared, nodded politely as they carried their laughter upstairs. But when I was finally alone in the dimly lit kitchen, I placed my hand on the cool marble counter and whispered to myself, "Not dead weight." Not ever, and in that moment a decision began to take root, a secret I would keep close to my chest. They thought I was powerless, but the truth was, I held the very key to the empire they wanted to inherit. They just didn't know it yet. That night, long after the laughter in the house had faded and the lights upstairs were turned off, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the flickering flame of a half-burnt candle. His words kept replaying in my head, over and over. Dead weight. I wanted to cry, but instead my mind wandered back through the years. Back to the beginning, I remembered myself as a young woman, cradling a boy with wide, innocent eyes who clung to me as though I was his entire world. And in truth I was. There was no one else. His father had passed too soon, leaving me with grief, bills, and a child who needed more than I thought I could ever give. But I gave it anyway. I worked mornings at the diner, serving coffee with a tired smile and evenings cleaning offices when the world was asleep. There were days when my feet ached so badly I could hardly stand, yet I never let him see the pain. When money ran low, I skipped meals, convincing him that I had already eaten. And when winter bit hard, I wore my thin coat, making sure he had the warm one. I did it all because I believed in him. Because I thought one day he would look back and say, "My mother gave me everything, and I will honor her for it." But children grow. And sometimes, the love you pour into them becomes invisible the moment they believe they stand on their own. I remembered saving every penny I could for his education. I pawned my grandmother's necklace, the only piece of jewelry I had left that carried real value, just so I could afford his textbooks one semester. I told myself it was worth it, that his success was my success, and for a time I thought I was right. He graduated, found work, married. He brought his new wife home, and I welcomed her with open arms, telling myself I was gaining a daughter. I cooked for them, made space for them, even when their laughter sometimes carried a sharp edge I couldn't ignore. But slowly, things shifted. Gratitude turned to expectation. Requests turned into demands. And my sacrifices, once praised, became forgotten footnotes in a story he no longer cared to remember. Now, when I look at the mansion around me, the polished floors, the grand staircase, the walls echoing with years of memories, I see more than bricks and beams. I see my sweat, my late husband's dreams, and every sleepless night I endured just to keep this place alive for him. And yet, to him, it is nothing but property. A prize he assumes will fall into his lap once I'm gone. The thought stings, but it doesn't break me. Instead, it fuels something new inside me. If he cannot see the weight of my sacrifices, then perhaps he will feel the weight of my silence, the sharpness of a choice he never saw coming. I blew out the candle that night with steady hands. The flame died, but within me another fire began to burn. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the mansion's grand hallway. The light danced across the polished wood floors, the same floors my late husband and I had spent months saving for, choosing carefully because we wanted a home that would last. To most, this house is simply impressive, a sprawling estate, a symbol of wealth. But to me, every corner carries a heartbeat. Every detail tells a story. When my husband and I first set eyes on this property, it was nothing but land and a crumbling structure. Others saw a burden too big to repair, but we saw potential. We poured ourselves into it, late nights sketching plans, long weekends painting walls, even when our bodies ached. This mansion became more than a roof over our heads. It became the dream we built with our bare hands, the legacy we promised our son. I can still picture my little boy running through these halls, his laughter echoing off the walls as though the house itself was alive with joy. His tiny hands smudged the glass doors I had just polished, but I didn't mind. To me, those smudges were proof of life, proof of family. This house was supposed to be a haven for him, a place where he would always feel safe and loved. But now it feels like a cage, not because the walls have changed, but because the people inside them have. I notice the way my son and his wife look around the rooms, not with fondness, not with the warmth of memory, but with calculation. Their eyes linger on the antique chandeliers, the original crown molding, the acres of land stretching out behind the house. They speak of upgrades and modernization, never understanding the weight of history that breathes in these walls. One evening, I overheard them whispering in the study. His wife said, "Once she signs it over, we'll finally be able to do what we want with the place." And my son, my own flesh and blood, replied, "It's just a matter of time." I remember standing outside the door, my hand pressed against the cool wood, holding back tears. They were already planning a future without me, as if I were a piece of old furniture they were waiting to move out. Still, I kept my face calm when I walked in. I smiled faintly when his wife asked about redecorating. I nodded politely when my son spoke about his vision for the house. But deep down, I knew they saw me not as the keeper of this mansion, but as an obstacle in their way. What they didn't realize was that while they were dreaming of their renovations and their grand future, I was dreaming too. Mine was quieter, sharper, and far more decisive. The mansion may have been built on sacrifice, but it would not be handed over to greed. This house was never meant to become a trophy for entitlement. I ran my hand along the banister that evening, feeling the smooth wood my husband had polished with pride so many years ago. I whispered softly, as though he could hear me still, "Don't worry. I won't let them destroy what we built." And with that vow, the quiet seed of my plan began to grow roots. The shift was slow at first, small remarks, little hints, the kind of comments you could almost excuse as careless. But then the masks slipped completely, and their greed stood naked in front of me. One afternoon, I was carrying a basket of freshly folded laundry upstairs when I heard them in the living room. They weren't whispering anymore. They weren't cautious. They were bold. "She doesn't even use half the house," my daughter-in-law said with a laugh. "All this space, and for what? She should just hand it over now instead of dragging things out." My son didn't hesitate. "She will. She has to. Once she's gone, the mansion is ours anyway. Might as well start planning." The basket in my arms grew heavier with each word. I stood frozen on the staircase, listening as the people I loved most reduced me to a placeholder, an obstacle, a name on a deed that they were just waiting to erase. They spoke freely, as though I were already gone. "I'm thinking we tear down the old dining room," his wife continued. "Open it up into a modern kitchen." "Oh, and that antique furniture? Outdated. We'll sell it all," my son chuckled. "Yeah, she clings to everything like it's sacred. She doesn't get that times have changed." "Don't worry, babe. It's all ours soon." I felt my throat tighten, but I forced myself to breathe quietly, to stay hidden. A part of me wanted to burst into the room, to demand how he could speak about me this way, how he could forget every sacrifice, every moment I bent my back to keep his world standing. But another part of me, stronger, calmer, told me to stay still. Let them talk. Let them reveal themselves completely. That evening at dinner, they didn't even try to mask their impatience. His wife casually brought up future renovations, asking me if I'd consider signing papers early, just to make things easier. I looked at her across the table, her perfectly painted smile stretching wide, and then at my son, who didn't even flinch at her suggestion. Instead, he nodded, as if it was a perfectly reasonable request. My heart sank, but I didn't let it show. I placed another spoonful of food on my plate and said softly, "We'll see." Inside, though, something inside me hardened. Later that week, I found them walking through the house with a contractor. They hadn't bothered to tell me. I stood quietly at the edge of the hallway, listening as they spoke about tearing out walls, removing windows, modernizing what my husband and I had fought so hard to preserve. The contractor asked, "And the deed? You'll need her signature first," my son replied without hesitation. "She won't resist. She can't. She knows it's ours anyway." That sentence pierced me deeper than any insult ever could. She won't resist. They thought of me as powerless, helpless, already defeated, but they were wrong. I stepped away quietly, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. And in that moment, I knew what had to be done. I would not confront them with tears. I would not beg for gratitude. I would not even argue. No, silence would be my weapon, and patience my shield. That night, as they laughed in the living room over renovation plans, I sat in my bedroom and opened the small drawer where I kept important documents. The deed, the proof of ownership, the legacy they were salivating over. I touched it gently, almost reverently, and whispered to myself, "Not yet. Not ever the way they expect. They thought they had stripped me of power, but the truth was, they had forgotten one simple fact. This house was mine. Every stone, every beam, every corner soaked in my sacrifice. It all belonged to me. And if they believed I would quietly fade into the shadows while they planned their empire, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I had spent my whole life reacting to bills, to hardships, to loss, to my son's growing indifference. But that night, as I held the deed in my hands, something inside me shifted. I realized it was time to stop reacting and start acting. If they saw me as dead weight, then I would become the anchor that pulled their greedy plans straight to the bottom. The next morning, I rose earlier than usual. I made breakfast as I always did, setting plates of food on the table, smiling faintly as they chatted about upcoming vacations. They had no idea that while they spoke of their future, I was already rewriting mine. As soon as they left for the day, I picked up the phone. My fingers trembled slightly, but my voice was steady as I called an old friend, a lawyer I hadn't spoken to in years but trusted deeply. "Mary?" His voice crackled on the line. "It's been a long time," I said softly. "I need your help." Quietly. By the end of that call, I had set into motion the first step of my plan. The following days became a careful dance. On the surface, I was the same woman, quiet, polite, folding laundry, preparing meals. But beneath that stillness, I was a storm. I met with my lawyer in secret, the deed clutched safely in my handbag. We spoke in hushed tones in his office, reviewing contracts and legal protections. "You're certain about this?" he asked, searching my face. I nodded. "If they see me as nothing, then they don't deserve something I've bled for. I won't hand this house to greed." He leaned back, respect flickering in his eyes. "Then we'll make sure every step is airtight." Soon after, I contacted a discreet real estate agent. We met at a small cafe across town, far away from prying eyes. I watched as she carefully flipped through market reports, explaining how much the mansion could sell for. The numbers were staggering, even more than I had expected. "Are you sure you want to sell such a beautiful property?" she asked, almost hesitant. I smiled faintly. "Beauty means nothing when it's poisoned." "Yes, I'm sure." Back at the mansion, my son strutted around as though he already owned the place. He bragged about his future inheritance to friends over the phone, talking about renovations he hadn't paid a dime for. I watched him sometimes from the corner of the room, my lips pressed together, my silence tighter than ever. He mistook my quiet for weakness. But what he didn't see was the satisfaction building inside me with every step closer I took toward freedom. At night, I would sit at the old oak desk in my study, going over documents by the faint light of a lamp. Every signature, every initial I placed on those papers felt like a knife slicing through their arrogance. My revenge wasn't loud or messy. It was meticulous, silent, and in the stillness of those late hours, I found strength I didn't know I had. The irony was delicious. While my son mocked me, calling me dead weight, I was the one moving mountains behind his back. While his wife dreamed of open-concept kitchens and modern furniture, I was quietly removing the very ground beneath their feet. I remember the night I signed the final agreement with the realtor. My hand didn't tremble at all this time. I placed the pen down, exhaled slowly, and whispered, "It's done." The mansion that had once symbolized sacrifice and legacy was no longer theirs to covet. It was mine to decide, and I had chosen justice. They laughed upstairs that evening, glasses clinking as they toasted to a future they thought was guaranteed. I smiled to myself in the shadows. They had no idea their empire had already been sold from under them. It happened on a Tuesday. I remember because the day began so peacefully, almost deceptively calm. The sunlight streamed through the windows. I brewed my tea, and for a brief moment, it felt like any other morning. But peace never lasts when greed is circling. I was in the kitchen when I heard the front door slam. Heavy footsteps thundered across the hall, sharper and faster than usual. My son's voice, loud and furious, cut through the air. "Mom, what the hell is this?" I turned slowly, teacup in hand, and saw him storming toward me, papers clenched in his fist. His wife trailed behind, her face flushed red with anger. "You sold the house?" His voice cracked high with disbelief. "Tell me this isn't real." I didn't answer immediately. I set my cup down gently, letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of their shock sink in. His wife slammed her handbag onto the counter. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "We had plans. I cut her off with a calmness that startled even me. "Yes, I know exactly what I've done." My son's eyes widened, the same eyes that once looked up at me for comfort, now glaring with entitlement. "This was supposed to be ours. You had no right." I met his gaze evenly. No, right? This house was built with my hands, with my husband's dreams, with sacrifices you will never understand. Every wall, every corner, every inch, paid for by me. Tell me, what right did you think you had to claim it as your own? He stuttered, searching for words, but his wife jumped in. We're family. Family means sharing, handing things down. Family, I repeated softly, the word heavy on my tongue. Family means respect, love, gratitude, not mockery, not greed. You don't want family. You want inheritance. The room fell silent for a beat, the truth hanging between us like a blade. My son finally found his voice, though it came out broken. You tricked us. Behind our backs? I shook my head slowly. No, son. I didn't trick you. I simply stopped pretending I didn't see who you've become. He slammed the papers on the counter, his fists shaking. You ruined everything! No, I said firmly, my voice sharper now, stronger. I saved myself. If I am, as you called me, dead weight, then you should have no trouble moving on without me, or without this house. His face drained of color, the weight of his own words crashing back on him. He opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. His wife muttered something under her breath, pacing like a caged animal, furious that their golden prize had slipped away. For the first time in years, I felt taller than both of them. I felt unshakable. You may have thought I was powerless, I continued, my voice low but steady. But you forgot, the mansion was never yours. It was mine. And now it belongs to no one who would laugh at the woman who gave them everything. The silence that followed was deafening. My son stood there, his jaw tight, his chest rising and falling in quick, uneven breaths. He looked at me not with love, not even with anger, but with the dawning realization that he had lost. Finally, he turned away, muttering curses under his breath, his wife tugging at his arm. They stormed out, the door slamming behind them, leaving the house eerily quiet. I sat back down at the table, lifted my cup of tea, and took a slow sip. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. For the first time in a long time, I felt nothing but peace. The empire they thought was theirs had crumbled in their hands, and I hadn't needed to raise my voice to do it. Final chapter. The mansion stood empty the day I handed over the keys. I walked through each room slowly, my footsteps echoing in spaces once filled with laughter, arguments, and whispered dreams. I ran my hand along the walls, remembering the nights I stayed awake patching cracks with my own tired hands. The mornings I polished the floors until they gleamed. The dinners I cooked with nothing but faith and determination. This house had carried my life, my love, my sacrifices. But a house is only wood and stone if the people inside forget what it means to be family. The realtor smiled as she took the final signature. It's official. The property is no longer yours. I nodded, a strange lightness lifting from my chest. Good, I whispered. Let it be someone else's beginning. Outside, I saw my son's car parked across the street. He hadn't come in, hadn't spoken to me since that explosive day. He just sat there with his wife, staring at the home they thought would be theirs. I didn't wave. I didn't go to him. For once, I didn't feel the need to chase after love that had long stopped chasing me. Instead, I walked past them with my head held high, the faintest smile playing on my lips. My life was no longer chained to their greed. I used the money from the sale to buy myself a small sunlit cottage on the edge of town. It wasn't grand, it wasn't sprawling, but it was mine. Every corner felt warm, safe, alive. I planted flowers out front, brewed tea by the window, and for the first time in decades, I lived for myself, not for anyone else's comfort. Some nights, I sat on the porch and thought of my late husband. I imagined him beside me, smiling that quiet, proud smile. You did the right thing, I heard him say in my heart, and I believed it. As for my son, I heard whispers about the debts piling up, about the fights with his wife, about how the dream of easy wealth had vanished into smoke. I didn't gloat, didn't curse him. I simply let life teach him the lessons I no longer had the strength to repeat. My justice wasn't in watching him fall. My justice was in rising again. I had been mocked as dead weight, dismissed as useless, overlooked in the very home I had built. But in the end, I was the one who walked away free, while they remained prisoners of their own greed. And that, I realized, was the sweetest victory of all.